Welcome in to CBS News 24/7. I'm Elizabeth Cook. In just a few hours, President Donald Trump will deliver an address to Congress and across the world. And this all comes as we are seeing a huge reaction on Wall Street to the tariffs Trump just levied on Canada, China, and Mexico. Stocks continue to fall today with fears of higher prices and escalating tensions prompting massive sell-offs. The S&P 500 is now down 2% for 2025, and the NASDAQ Composite Index is in correction territory. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau vowed to retaliate against Trump's tariffs. He is promising to impose tariffs of his own on the United States, saying he will not back down. Listen to Trudeau call out President Trump directly in an address earlier today.
Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal, but Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do. We two friends fighting is exactly what our opponents around the world want to see.
Now, Trudeau says Canada will impose a 25% tariff on $107 billion worth of U.S. goods by March 25th. Those are likely to impact American beer, wine, bourbon, home appliances, and other goods. And just moments ago, President Trump posted a response on Truth Social. He writes, quote, "Please explain to Governor Trudeau of Canada that when he puts on a retaliatory tariff on the U.S., our reciprocal tariff will immediately increase by a like amount." All right, let's bring in CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, what do you make of this back and forth we're seeing here? Are there any winners in this situation?
There don't tend to be in a trade war, just because you do have both sides and citizens of both countries really bearing a lot of that pain, the businesses as well. I have two reactions to this. So the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, they're all part of this trade agreement that was signed under Trump's first administration, the USMCA, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. It replaced NAFTA. And because of that, we have really built such a interconnected supply chain across a number of different industries. And I think a lot of folks who are proponents of free trade are looking at what Prime Minister Trudeau is saying, the fact that he's pushing back and saying, yes, you know, when you have a trade agreement, these are not things that should be done. That aside, though, I think what's going to be really interesting is how long Prime Minister Trudeau and Canada is able to hold out. Because at the end of the day, you asked, are there any winners here? No, but there might be folks that lose more. Canada does rely on the U.S. Economically more so than we do. We rely on them a lot, certainly, but I do think this is going to be interesting to see how long this pushback is going to be able to hold up. Is it just rhetoric, or is Canada willing to suffer a lot of pain for its businesses and consumers?
I want to talk about China for a minute here, Kelly, because Beijing retaliated with a 15% tariff on many farm exports, among other things. And China is our biggest competitor when it comes to trade, and we also rely on them heavily when it comes to manufacturing, especially in the tech sector. What's sort of the bigger picture when it comes to getting into a trade war, specifically with China?
So this I find so interesting, Liz, because there's actually a lot of bipartisan support for the tariffs that we are seeing go in place on China. Remember, there were tariffs against China under the first Trump administration. The Biden administration kept many of those and, in fact, increased some. So there has definitely been bipartisan agreement that because, as you say, China is a very big competitor in a number of different industries, we do need to protect American industries and dominance. The other part of it, though, is the farming aspect of it. And I'm glad you brought up those retaliatory tariffs, Liz. I went to Missouri a few weeks ago to speak with a corn and soybean farmer, and he told me the industry was just decimated under the first Trump administration because by putting a retaliatory tariff on those industries, it made it nearly impossible to sell to China, which is their biggest market. overnight, so much of their revenue was wiped out. The government had to come in and give a very big aid package, billions and billions of dollars to the agriculture industry in this country. And so, the broad picture, I think a lot of people are in agreement about this tit for tat with China. But then you look at very specific industries in this country that are going to just really feel the pain. They don't really get a benefit from a trade war, if you will.
Yeah, you see the impact, especially on those smaller businesses. Kelly O'Grady, thank you so much. All right, all eyes on our nation's capital right now, where President Trump prepares to deliver his first address to a joint session of Congress tonight. The president likely to touch on those sweeping tariffs and that response to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. All right, let's start there at the White House with CBS News senior White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. Weijia, we saw the markets responding to these tariffs dramatically, in fact. Americans may be concerned about how this is going to impact their 401ks, and a lot of Americans, remember, voted for Trump because he vowed to make it easier to afford things like groceries and really everything else. Any word for the White House on how Trump is going to address that concern tonight?
Well, the White House says that one major focus of his speech tonight will be the broader economy and inflation. But you're right. To have this all unfolding right now, just hours before he's set to deliver that speech, certainly begs the question of how he might rewrite or alter his message, because I think it would be a mistake not to address the elephant in the room when you are having these tumbling stocks, when you are seeing people's retirements and investments really spiral, because that would be not fulfilling his campaign promise that you so rightfully laid out, that he said he would make things economically better for Americans. So the question is how he will present that and frame it. Of course, we know that he has said tariffs are a powerful tool, and he has linked this to the flow of illegal immigrants and illegal drugs, specifically fentanyl, into the borders. But one thing, Liz, that I think is important context is that when it comes to Canada, the amount of fentanyl that comes in from the northern border overall, when you look at all the fentanyl that comes into the U.S. every year, is 0.2%. That's less than 0.5%. And, Canada has taken a lot of steps to try to curb it even more, but Trump has made clear he doesn't think that's enough. So that's why we are now locked in this trade war that looks like it's going to be escalated again, because Trump has said, look, if you retaliate on us, that number on Canadian goods or Mexican goods is just going to go up again.
Yeah, and speaking of Canada, I want to get back to those comments from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Weijia, I want to play part of those remarks and get your take on the other side.
The United States launched a trade war against Canada, their closest partner and ally, their closest friend. At the same time, they're talking about working positively with Russia, appeasing Vladimir Putin, a lying, murderous dictator. Make that make sense.
Weijia, he says the U.S. is, quote, appeasing Putin. This seems to be just the latest attack on the administration after that Oval Office blowout. Fallout from that still playing out today. What's the latest that you're hearing?
Well, we know that the U.S. has now decided to suspend aid to Ukraine. Now, remember, America has been the largest military backer of Ukraine since the start of this war, providing about $180 billion worth of aid overall, including more than $60 billion in military aid. But officials here say they are pausing it because they want to make sure that the money is going toward a solution. But I think Trump would argue that his tactics are working, because we saw an incredibly lengthy statement from President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine earlier today, and he stopped short of saying, I'm sorry, but he did express extreme regret for the way things played out during that Oval Office blow-up, and said that he really wants to get things back on course with the United States and with Trump. He also praised the president's leadership and talked about how, he is ready to find a quick end to the war. And so we'll have to see whether Trump hears that message and decides to resume aid, and also decides to put the minerals deal back on the table, which of course he yanked off after he and Zelensky and Vance had that very public confrontation.
And while we have you, Ouija, you've got some news about a major reversal from the Office of Personnel Management. What do you know?
Yeah, well, you'll remember this is essentially the HR department of the government, and it sent out memos several weeks ago essentially mandating sweeping firings of probationary workers. Now, those are workers who have either less than 1 or less than 2 years of experience. And frankly, it's easier to fire them because they have fewer protections than full-fledged civil servants who have been there longer. And you'll remember we told the stories of many federal workers who unexpectedly lost their jobs. But now that HR department, OPM, has issued a new statement to say that basically you don't have to carry out these mass terminations, that it's really up to each agency to go through and decide how they want to structure their staffing. Well, that's all well and good now, but Liz, so many, tens of thousands of federal probationary workers have already lost their jobs. I'm still in touch with several of them who are unemployed and scrambling to find new work because they're competing against each other for jobs in the private sector.
All right, Ouija Jang reporting live for us from the White House. Ouija, thank you so much. And remember to stay with CBS News 24/7 for continuing coverage of the president's address to Congress. Join us at 5 p.m. Eastern for a special edition of America Decides. The speech is on at 9 p.m., followed by the Democratic response. Then we'll have full analysis and highlights from our team of correspondents and contributors. Another headline out of the Trump White House today, the U.S. pausing aid to Ukraine. We mentioned it earlier. That's until Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky commits to peace talks. Vice President J.D. Vance speaking out this morning saying he thinks a deal can be reached, but Ukraine needs to reach out. Let's take a listen to that.
Look, I think the most important thing, a lot of people have made this about public statements. President Zelensky needs to say that he's committed to the peace, or President Zelensky needs to apologize to the president. The public stuff doesn't matter nearly as much as what are the Ukrainians doing to meaningfully engage on what a peaceful settlement would look like. We need the Ukrainians privately to come to us and say, this is what we need, this is what we want, this is how we're going to participate in the process to end this conflict. That is the most important thing, and that lack of private engagement is what is most concerning to us.
Volodymyr Zelensky responding on X shortly after that, saying he is ready to come to the negotiating table and sign a deal relating to minerals and security. But it's still unclear if or when that aid, which has been critical in fending off Russian forces, will be reinstated. MTS Taib is in Ukraine's capital with what this means.
Well, a Ukrainian official has told CBS News the Trump administration's suspension of military aid to Ukraine gives the country only around 6 months before it starts running short of vital ammunition, as the White House continues to pile pressure on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to pursue peace with Russian leader Vladimir Putin after that shouting match in the Oval Office last week Friday, which was really heard around the world. But we have some other reporting which has found that the decision to pause or suspend aid to Ukraine, as the Trump administration has put it, was really made all the way back in January, on the 21st of January, which was the first full day that President Trump was in office. So it really does feel as if that this plan had been placed and we're only just hearing about it now. Whatever the case, Ukrainian leaders continue to grapple with what to do next. They will no doubt increasingly turn to European partners who already provide just over 50% of the military assistance Ukraine receives as Russia's war rages on. Overnight, the Kremlin launched major drone strikes on the cities of Sumy and Odessa. Back to you.
MTS, thank you. Newly minted Education Secretary Linda McMahon says she will lead a, quote, final mission to end bloat at the department that President Trump has vowed to close. McMahon says that the overhaul will profoundly impact staff and budgeting, but she stopped short of saying that the department would close altogether. Coming up, a parliament session in Serbia erupts into chaos. There was tear gas, smoke grenades, and one lawmaker even suffered a stroke. We'll show you what led up to the clash. You're watching CBS News 24/7. right, you got to check this out. What happened on the floor of Serbia's parliament today? It looked more like an intense clash between rival sports fans rather than a meeting of lawmakers. Take a look at this. This was unbelievable. Members of parliament set off air horns and threw smoke grenades and tear gas in clashes between the opposition and ruling majority. It was opening day of the spring session of parliament, and the chaos just erupted as the opposition party staged a protest in support for anti-corruption demonstrations. Now, one lawmaker held up a banner that read, "Serbia is rising up for the regime to fall." In the end, 3 members of parliament were injured, one of them suffering a stroke. Student-led anti-corruption protests have been going on for months now, sparked by the collapse of a train station roof last year, which killed 15 people. The movement has put intense pressure on the Serbian president and the government, and even prompted the prime minister to resign in January. Now, back here in the U.S., the U.S. Supreme Court is hearing arguments on a $10 billion lawsuit Mexico filed against U.S. gun makers. The Mexican government tried to hold U.S. manufacturers like Smith & Wesson and Interstate Arms accountable for their part in supplying weapons to drug cartels in their country. All right, so break down the case and more. Let's bring in CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford. Jan, great to see you. Thank you for being with us. It's interesting because this case is coming during a really tense time between the U.S. and Mexico. We've got tariffs, we've got illegal immigration enforcement, and the Trump administration designating Mexican cartels as terrorist groups. How does this case play into all of that?
You know, that's such a great question, and it kind of shows that you don't really know what the timing of a lawsuit is going to be when it actually does reach the Supreme Court. I mean, obviously, this case has been percolating for a while. It's gone through the trial court, then the appeals court, and now, of course, it finally has reached the United States Supreme Court. And, you know, how is it going to play into all this? I honestly don't think it will at all, because I think Mexico is obviously going to lose this case. I mean, the justices today on both sides of the aisle, the conservatives and liberals like Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, very skeptical of Mexico's arguments that it should be able to hold gun maker Smith & Wesson and a distributor accountable for the gun violence that is caused by the cartels in this country. They're arguing that upwards of, 500,000 guns are getting smuggled into Mexico illegally every year, that 70 to 90% of those guns are being recovered at crime scenes by the cartels, and that the makers and the distributors should have some responsibility for that because they knew or should have known that was going to be used for criminal activity. So they're aiding and abetting the commission of these crimes by the cartels. That is a bridge, I think, that is going to be too far for these justices. And there's a reason for that. There's a 2005 law that was passed by Congress that sets a very high bar for these kind of lawsuits against the gun industry. And the justices today very skeptical that Mexico is going to be able to clear that bar.
Well, the news today, of course, was about the tariffs. I'm curious, though, will that play into this case at all?
That, again, I mean, I think it's hard to see how it would, because the justices, and this was such a technical argument, looking at the specifics of this law and whether or not that actually could apply here, that I don't think that will at all. But to your point, it definitely comes at a time when we have these heightened tensions. We see the Mexican president is going to be meeting with President Trump later this week. But this is a case between the gun makers and Mexico. Like, the federal government's not involved at this point. And I don't think that there's really going to be a need for anything to happen here, because I think the court is going to say, yes, victims of gun violence can sue, but there's a high bar. I mean, obviously, the Sandy Hook victims were able to sue, and they were settled for almost $100 million, but 3/4 of that. But it's going to be hard, and I just don't see any way that Mexico's lawsuit that they're trying to sue is going to get any further than this, Liz.
While I have you here, Jan, I want to ask you about another case we're watching today. Supreme Court justices holding an emergency hearing after a Seattle judge blocked Trump's executive order to suspend the U.S. refugee resettlement program. What more can you tell us about that case?
Well, that is one of several cases that the Supreme Court right now is kind of weighing, in their private conferences or behind closed doors, nothing public, of course, whether or not and when they're going to get involved in some of these Trump executive orders. So we've got a number of them already where the justices are kind of deciding what they're going to do next. Obviously, a lot of lower court judges are blocking some of these executive orders, especially the ones where Trump is trying to fire people or freeze funding. And so the court is considering whether or not Trump has that authority or whether or not the lower court rulings can stand, and whether the court's going to step in and put some kind of pause on them. So that's something that could come anytime this week, next week. We just don't know. But we're really waiting to see that, because obviously a conflict, when the first of these Trump cases reach the Supreme Court, it's going to be really interesting to see what they say about presidential power, Liz.
We're all going to be watching. CBS News Chief Legal Correspondent Jan Crawford. Thank you so much, Jan. Always great to see you. All right, let's take a look at this drone video out of Louisville, Texas, where part of a Benjamin Moore warehouse completely collapsed. Hurricane-force winds have been slamming into the Dallas metro area and beyond. I want to bring in Jess now, because this is just the start of the storm. It's it has legs.
It does, and it's moving. So we talked about it yesterday. We were gearing up for what was to come today. Damaging winds, heavy amounts of rain, and tornado activity possible in states anywhere from Texas over into Louisiana. But the system is moving off into the east in live time right now. So I'm going to break that apart for you and show you where it's at and where it's going. And the damage that it's caused so far, well, we've been seeing dust storms and severe winds all throughout Texas. And as the system continues to track off into the east, it'll bring in similar conditions over into areas like Mississippi, Alabama. And it's already the big reason why New Orleans had to cancel some events for Mardi Gras. Now, as we head into the next 48 hours, this exact same system will continue to sweep its way over into the Carolinas. There's snow to the north up near Minneapolis from the same area of low pressure, and heavy, severe weather widespread throughout the south. Here's the winds right now. Areas like Lubbock, Texas, all the way over into Dallas, still anywhere up to around 30 to 50 mile per hour winds forecasted there. As the system tracks off into the east, it takes the winds with it. So now we're talking about Kansas City heading into Wednesday morning, anywhere up to around 45 mile per hour wind gusts expected there. That'll continue to track off into the east and to the north as we head into the coming days. Now, at the same time, we have to talk about the rain and the snow, because this will impact many people throughout the south as we head into the coming days. Now, timing this out into Wednesday morning, now we're seeing heavy rain closer to Atlanta, all the way over into the Carolinas as we head into our Wednesday evening forecast. At the same time, snow lingers throughout the Great Lakes and all the way up into the mid-Atlantic as we head into our Thursday forecast too. But let's take it a step back and talk about the severe weather outlook. With that enhanced risk anywhere from New Orleans all the way up into Jackson, Mississippi, we continue to keep a close eye on the tornado threat there, with about 10% risk currently throughout those areas. We head over into Louisiana. You see that little red speck? That's the National Weather Service in live time issuing updated tornado warnings throughout counties and just throughout communities all throughout those areas. This map has been updated every 30 minutes or so far, and we've watched these storms continue to move off into the east.
I mean, wow, those people there are bracing for impact. All right, Jess, thanks
Of
so
course.
much. All right, we have an update on the health of Pope Francis. The Pope is in stable condition with no new respiratory crises. This is Vatican City's St. Peter's Square last night, where people from all over the world gathered to pray for the health of Pope Francis. Let's go now to CBS News foreign correspondent Chris Livesay reporting for us from Rome. Chris, what more do we know at this hour?
Hey, Liz. Well, like you said, the Vatican is reporting now that he hasn't had any more respiratory crises, which is a very encouraging sign for the 88-year-old pontiff. Yesterday, we had some discouraging news when we found out that the pontiff had not just one but two episodes of acute respiratory crisis or insufficiencies of oxygen, and the doctors had to intervene and aspirate mucus from his passageways in order to get him breathing again normally. But as of this morning, the Vatican is reporting that he is off of this mechanical ventilator, this artificially mechanic ventilator that he's had to use a few times. He's back to using high flow oxygen with these nasal tubes. They're also careful to point out that he is going to be back on the mechanical ventilator until tomorrow morning, but that appears to be something planned and not a reaction to a bad episode. So it's encouraging signs. Yesterday was a bad day. Pope Francis has had good days and bad since he checked into the hospital 2.5 weeks ago with a bad case of bronchitis that really spiraled into not just pneumonia, but double pneumonia. Very serious for anybody, let alone an 88-year-old pontiff who is already missing part of a lung from a respiratory illness he suffered as a young man. Liz.
Chris Livesay, live for us from Rome. Thanks so much, Chris. Well, coming up, we are watching stocks slide with the markets reacting to Trump's tariffs on Canada, China, and Mexico. We'll dig deep into this story. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Welcome back to CBS News 24/7. Turning our attention to Capitol Hill now, where lawmakers there preparing for tonight's joint address from President Trump. Democrats spent the morning slamming Trump's agenda in the first 43 days of his administration. And just moments ago, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer had this to say on the steps of Capitol Hill. Take a listen.
What Donald Trump won't do, is incapable of doing, is being straight with the American people about the mess he's already created in his short time in office. I don't think we've ever seen a president do as much damage to a country in 30 days as Donald Trump has done. On day one, he promised a golden age. 1 month later, that promise seems like ancient history. If there's any gold to be found in the Trump agenda, it's fool's gold. All glitter, no value. Frankly, when he speaks tonight, what can he possibly say that the American people should take seriously? Donald Trump has done nothing to brag about tonight. It hasn't even been 50 days, and he's already made a huge mess of our country.
Now, meanwhile, Republicans are approaching tonight's address with a very different tone. House Majority Leader Steve Scalise says the GOP has a lot to celebrate. Take a listen.
We're celebrating a lot. Tonight, President Trump is going to be celebrating the renewal of the American dream. And he's going to go into a lot of detail about how his agenda not only is starting to be carried out in just less than 2 months. It's been a riveting pace that President Trump took to start getting our country back on track. But the work is just beginning. Here in the House, and obviously Congress has to play a critical role in helping the president do this.
All right, let's bring in CBS News congressional reporter Torian Small for more on all this. Torian, two very different messages are being given today. Can you walk us through what we're watching for from Congress tonight?
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on decorum in this forum here. This isn't a State of the Union address, but this will serve as a de facto, considering it's President Trump's, although it's a second term, his first term or first year in office in just a matter of weeks, really, which is why Speaker Johnson brought him to the Hill to deliver these remarks. He said, Johnson, that is, said that he wants President Trump to outline what he's seeing as successes that happened in such a short period of time. I should also outline that it's not just in the fast-track confirmations, but the dramatic slimming of the government, which is what Democrats look to underscore as well, which is why we see so many Democratic members bring in fired federal workers as their special guests tonight. Quite a few press conferences throughout the day underscoring that fact as well. But again, I'm watching for decorum. It's interesting that Congresswoman Lauren Boebert of Colorado told us earlier today that she's expecting political theater. She was one of a handful of Republicans at several points during the Biden administration State of the Union addresses to vocally heckle him during his speech. So we're seeing if Democrats might do so in turn during tonight's speech.
And Torian, just moments ago, our cameras caught House Speaker Mike Johnson in the halls of Capitol Hill. He says he spoke to the president about an hour ago about the looming government spending deadline. I want to play some of that and then talk on the other side.
Did you have talked to him? Just talked to him within the last 30 minutes about that and other things. He's fully supportive of the idea, understands the wisdom of it. We want to finish FY25, free spending, and then we get to FY26, which is where the real reform is going to come in, because By the time we get to the next appropriations process, we'd be working to restore regular order in that, and the DOGE cuts will be actualized by that point. We'll be able to qualify and then quantify to prepare to codify what Elon Musk and the DOGE effort has been uncovering. So I think that will change the equation pretty dramatically for FY26, and we're very much looking forward to getting to that point.
So, Torian, what's at stake here for Republicans as this government spending deadline approaches?
So we're hearing that there are two tracks that Republicans are pursuing in this continuing resolution. One would see a longer term, so to the end of the year, stopgap measure in order to ensure that we avoid a government shutdown later this month, and that the relative or relevant departments are funded fully throughout the year. The other one is a short-term spending bill that would see that expire by sometime in September, and that appears to be the one that Democrats are saying they could be on board with. Senator Pat Murray took to the floor not too long ago to say that he's not on board for anything long-term. What he's agreeing to is Biden-era levels of spending now as negotiations continue across the aisle on this longer-term fiscal year 2026 budget that was passed through budget resolution and will ultimately be seen through budget reconciliation. The thing, though, is 218 is the magic number for House Republicans. There are quite a few members that would like to see deeper cuts sooner than later. So Speaker Johnson understands that he has to get support from Democrats in order to pass any short-term spending bill, if it is to pass through cleanly without those extended cuts. As it relates to DOGE and how that plays a factor in this, Johnson says that any DOGE cuts would not be seen in this budget, as this is just a continuation through 2025. 2026, though, is where they're looking to codify many of those cuts that we've seen across the departments, which has been the biggest question and concern for lawmakers, especially on the left side of the aisle. They're saying that the executive branch should not be able to control the purse. Well, Speaker Johnson is saying Congress will, under his leadership, do just that.
Torian Small live for us on Capitol Hill. Thanks so much, Torian. We'll be watching. And remember to stay with CBS News 24/7 for continuing coverage of the president's address to Congress tonight. Join us at 5 p.m. Eastern for a special edition of America Decides. The speech is at 9 p.m., followed by the Democratic response. Then we'll have full analysis and highlights from our team of correspondents and contributors. All right, take a live look at some container ships in the San Francisco Bay Area. Just some of the many shipments that come into the U.S. every day from our trade partners all over the world. Now, this all comes as President Trump put tariffs on goods from Canada, Mexico, and China. Now, with those tariffs taking effect, let's take a look at how the Dow is doing. The S&P 500 now down 2% for 2025, and the Nasdaq Composite Index is in correction territory. Investors are fearing a trade war, and Americans are wondering what this means for their 401ks. Among other big financial decisions, let's bring in Eric Diden, the president and managing director of the Wealth Alliance. Eric, thank you for being with us. Walk us through what's happening right now in the markets. It's pretty scary, and how it's all connected to Trump's tariffs. I'm telling all my friends, do not look at your 401ks.
Well, it's interesting. We're just about 5 years later from COVID. And 5 years ago, the stock market dropped about 35% in 5 weeks. 401ks plummeted. And quite frankly, there was nothing good in the horizon. It was every reason to sell out of stocks. We looked like we were on the verge of a global depression. If you locked in those losses, it was brutal. You could not recover from that. So the first thing is you don't panic. You stay calm. Now, I don't know why anyone's surprised. Donald Trump, the whole time he was running for president, said, I am going to institute tariffs. And everyone's saying, oh my God, he actually, yeah, he said he was going to do it. Let's be clear. Donald Trump is not a politician first. He's from the business world first. His goal is not to destroy the economy. He definitely does not want to do that. In fact, he's very, very connected to the stock market. He's that guy. But he is a ruthless negotiator. And even though he wants the stock market to do well, he does not mind short-term pain to achieve his results. And so that's where we're at. There are tariffs They are painful. We're just starting. I think it's going to get uglier. But to try to actually decide when this is going to bottom, how this is going to turn, I don't think Donald Trump knows exactly what he's going to do yet. And we certainly do not. What we do know, at least I believe, is that the tariffs against Canada and Mexico, I don't believe they're permanent. I think these are negotiating ploys. I think China is a different story, a major competitive threat. And I think those tariffs could really stick for the foreseeable future. The bottom line is have faith in the system, know that the president's not trying to destroy the economy.
Okay, that's an interesting take, because I want to talk about this. One of the largest retailers in the U.S. weighed in on what Trump's tariffs will mean for prices in the grocery aisle, which was what a lot of people were concerned about leading up to the election. And in an interview with CNBC, Target CEO Brian Cornell said, quote, the consumer will likely see prices increase over the next couple of days. If there's a 25% tariff, those prices will go up. So, Eric, tell us more about how quickly these tariffs might trickle down to American consumers. I mean, it sounds like we're going to start feeling the pain pretty quickly.
Yeah, and this is an unfortunate part because, as we all know, we've been combating inflation now for a couple of years, and the consumer has been struggling. So a tariff, make no mistake, and by the way, I'm not a fan of tariffs, but a tariff is a tax. It's an out-and-out tax on goods. The importer pays it, and they've got to pass it along to the consumer or they're going to get crushed. So yes, I think in a relatively short period of time, probably a few weeks, you will see higher prices translate to the consumer. And that is, again, short-term pain. And that's why you're seeing the bond market is rallying, yields are coming down. That means the bond market is seeing a slowing in the economy. It's the reverse of when rates were rising before and the economy was booming. And so this probably will slow economic growth down, at least in the near term.
All right, Eric Dighton, thank you so much for that insight.
Pleasure.
Well, it is Fat Tuesday in the Big Easy. Mardi Gras festivities in full swing in New Orleans. We'll take you live to Bourbon Street when we come back. You're watching CBS News 24/7. Welcome back. A major winter storm is moving across the country, bringing with it strong winds and heavy rain. Wet weather also arriving to New Orleans. Here's a look from EarthCam. It's showing us parade goers on Bourbon Street celebrating Mardi Gras. City officials reworked this year's festivities to avoid wind pickups, earlier parade start times, and shorter routes. So let's go to CBS News reporter Katie Weiss. She is live in the Big Easy for us. Katie, a big downpour expected soon. How are people celebrating now? I have a feeling that's not going to slow some people down.
Well, you know, it wasn't slowing people down earlier today. People were out here bright and early this morning to watch the parades that started much earlier than planned, just so that way they could get some fun in while they could. Now you can see a much different situation. People are leaving New Orleans. They're heading out of the Garden Street, the parade district. There's lots of traffic here, and people are being told to go home. I don't know if you hear in the distance, there's a cacophony of sirens from several federal agents, state and local officers as well, who are all blaring their sirens all at once to essentially kick people out of the parading area, because we just found out that there's been a tornado watch issued right here in this area. At last check, our meteorologist has told me just within the last hour, winds of 47 miles an hour were recorded at the airport here in New Orleans. And you see all this debris here left behind from what Mardi Gras is all about, you know, having a good time. Lots of people leaving trash, unfortunately, on the ground. All of this stuff could become projectiles in that heavy wind. So that's why officers are encouraging people to go ahead and get out of here and go home. You've had enough fun on Fat Tuesday.
Yeah, safety a top priority there, as well as security. I mean, just 2 months after that terrorist attack on Bourbon Street killed 14 people, how is the city responding to that? How has security changed this year, given that attack?
Well, you know, security is the strongest that it's ever been here in the city. We have seen armed officers in full tactical gear on just about every block of the parade route. And these security measures are in place because of that terrorist attack. The mayor advocated for what's called a Tier 1 rating after the attack took place in early January for Mardi Gras to get that Tier 1 rating. It's the highest level of security rating that the government can assign to a city, to a special event, and that's the same kind of rating that the Super Bowl got. So we here in New Orleans, we've been seeing helicopter patrols, water patrols for over a month now across the city for several parades that have been going on leading up to today's big finale.
All right, CBS News reporter Katie Weiss in New Orleans for us. Glad people are going to safety. They've had their fun. Now go indoors and stay safe. All right, Katie, thanks. All right, still ahead, they've been stuck in space for 9 months. Now they're finally about to return to Earth. With the very latest, you're watching CBS News 24/7. More key hearings unfolding on Capitol Hill today. Happening right now, the House Transportation Subcommittee on Aviation holding a hearing on the status of air traffic control. This all comes just 1 month after the plane collision at Reagan National Airport that killed 67 people. Chairman Troy Nehls sounded the alarm, calling for major investments in the aging system. Take a listen.
I want to be very clear. The reason that we are here today is that in its current form, this country's air traffic control system is unsustainable. It's unsustainable. That statement shouldn't come as a surprise to those in this room. In fact, many of the panelists before us today have been ringing the alarm bell for decades on the need for ATC modernization, increased hiring of controllers, and stable funding streams for the FAA.
Now, several key witnesses also testifying today, including the CEO of American Airlines and the president of the National Air Traffic Controllers Association. And in just the past hour, we just heard from 2 NASA astronauts that have been stuck in space for the past 9 months. And they are finally set to return home and spoke out today from the International Space Station. Astronauts Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams blasted off from space to the space station back in June and expected to only be there for about 2 weeks. But the Starliner capsule that took them there experienced multiple issues. And while they're finally coming home, they say they're going to miss space.
We came up prepared to stay long, even though we planned to stay short. That's what we do in human spaceflight. That's what your nation's human spaceflight program is all about, planning for unknown, unexpected contingencies. And we did that. And that's why we flowed, as Nick said, right into Crew 9, into Expedition 72, as we did. And it was somewhat of a seamless transition because we had planned ahead for it and we were prepared.
It brings to mind family and all the people on the ground who support us. So, you know, it's been a roller coaster for them, probably a little bit more so than for us. You know, we're here, we have a mission, we're just doing what we do every day. And, you know, every day is interesting because we're up in space and it's a lot of fun.
Now, Crew 9 contributed hundreds of science experiments to the space station. They'll head back to Earth after the arrival of Crew 10, which is expected to launch March 12th. I'm sure they are counting down the days. All right, remember to stay with CBS News 24/7 for continuing coverage of the president's address to Congress there in D.C. Join us at 5 p.m. Eastern for a special edition of America Decides. The speech is at 9 p.m., followed by the Democratic response. Stay with us.